Thank you very much, good to be back at Passport. I see so many familiar faces. And what I've been asked to speak on is the subject of my latest book, which is entitled Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism, and the question of, is there an alternative to capitalism? So I want to begin this way. 2 decades ago, Karl Marx and his ideas was largely considered a dead letter in most quarters. Most people probably thought that his ideas were passé, and that, as the phrase was, Marxism is dead. But 2 decades later, today in 2012, there's an explosion of interest in Marx's ideas from different places around the world, books, conferences, kind of new research, even getting into the popular press, and thank you so much. The situation has changed remarkably, frankly. Now, what's the reason for this? Why is Marx coming back into the headlines? I think there's 4 basic reasons. One is the phenomenon of globalization, which we're all familiar with. The world is becoming more interconnected, and more the world is being connected to the market global capitalist system. This connects very much to Marx, because Marx wrote 150 years ago that the distinctive feature of capitalism is to try to transcend, as an economic system, national borders, and to ultimately create what he called a world market, and even ultimately create a system of world money. And we seem to be moving in that direction today. The second thing that has brought Marx back to attention is the depth of inequality that has become increasingly pervasive over the last 2 or 3 decades. And that, as many people know, one of Marx's strongest criticisms of capitalism is that while it's a remarkably productive system and it generates an enormous amount of material wealth, it also generates vast social inequities and inequalities. The third element that I think is bringing Marx back into the headlines is the emphasis on environmental destruction. Because another thing that Marx argued is that part of the nature of capitalism is to strive to commodify more and more aspects of everyday life, to treat everything in terms of how much it can fetch on the market in terms of cash nexus. To the point, Marx argued, that where even nature will be considered a commodity one day and will be devastated and destroyed for the sake of mere accumulation of capital. Well, we seem to be living through a lot of that now. Especially young people feel this very strongly. But the fourth and most important reason that I think Marx is back in a climate of discussion today are the events since 2008, the most important and serious economic downturn since the Great Depression. And as of now, nothing seems to have been done to resolve the root cause of this crisis. That is, a few things have been papered over, but the only real response by the ruling interests to this depth of this economic crisis, whether it's concerning the United States or Europe or elsewhere, is to seek greater austerity and tighten your belt and reduce living standards for the vast majority of people. As I've mentioned here before in earlier talks, some of the more, I would have to say, honest commentators in the field of economics and political theory, I often hear them say when I go to conferences that, well, we can't really say this that openly because this wouldn't be politically palpable. But frankly, the American people are going to have to learn at some point that it's not 3 or 4 years of belt tightening and austerity that's going to be needed. It's 4 or 5 decades. And this is being talked about more and more. Well, in response to this, a lot of people, especially young people, are saying, is that the future I have to look forward to? Is deteriorating environment and growing inequality, and most of all, permanent, as it were, ongoing austerity? Is that the only future that society has in store for us? And in response to that, there is a renewed discussion from a number of different quarters on, is there a possible alternative to capitalism as we know it? Now, it's that kind of question that definitely gave birth a year and a half ago to the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it represented just one reflection of a new generation that's not willing to accept austerity as its only future. And they have a good reason to be concerned about this, young people especially. And why is that? Well, 93% of all the increase in wealth over the past 10 years in this country, 93% of it has gone to less than 1% of the population. Get this, 80% of wage earners in the United States, 80% of those who earn a wage, earn in real dollar terms less money in wages than they did or would have in 1968. Third, cutbacks in education have been quite continuous. About 500,000 teachers have been laid off over the last 4 to 5 years, as if it's the teachers that are the cause of the economic problems. And here is, I think, what to me is the most troubling statistic, is that while the overall life expectancy of Americans on average continues to increase, although obviously we don't have the highest life expectancy of any country in the world. After all, we don't have the highest standard of living of any country in the world. Other countries have higher standards of living than ours. But while the average life expectancy continues to increase, over the past decade, it's been demonstrated that death rates and for those, especially males, under the age of 50, earning less than $50,000 a year, are increasing considerably. That is, life expectancy is dropping for a significant section of the American population. I think you should keep this in mind when people say, wouldn't it be a great idea to raise the retirement age for Social Security and Medicare? Keep that in mind, because a lot of people are not living longer, they're living shorter. In the richest country of the world, presumably. Now, all these things are the kind of issues that have been raised and discussed within the Occupy movement. A movement that is not much in the headlines as it was a few years ago, and certainly doesn't have the kind of presence as it did. But it's going to surface again in different forms, given the kind of problems that I'm simply briefly outlining here. Most important of all, this type of protest, the Occupy movement, the protests in Greece, the indignados in Spain, the various different movements against austerity, have changed the climate of discussion to a certain degree. There's been more discussion than I've seen in my lifetime openly about the problems and limitations of capitalism, and there is more discussion than I've ever experienced in the last several years on whether there is a possible alternative to capitalism. And it was for that reason that I decided to try to take a stand at this question in writing this book. Now, of course, I want to say from the outset, any effort to even discuss the question, is there an alternative to capitalism, runs into two big difficulties. I'll mention two. Just two. The first is, all social systems seem natural and eternal to its members. When people live in a social system for a historical period, it's only to be expected that they don't think there would be anything after that. For instance, in the Middle Ages, did people think they were living in the Middle Ages? I mean, did they think there was going to be something called modernity to come after them? No, they didn't call it the Middle Ages in the Middle Ages. They called that, the culmination of history, probably. Okay? Now we look back at them and say, oh, they were just in the middle. Okay? We like to think that we are at the end of history, perhaps, right? We're the culmination. Perhaps we're not any less fooled than they were, in a certain sense. But it's understandable that we react that way. When you're living within a social system that's been around for centuries, it's very easy simply to say it's normal and natural to live this way, because after all, we've always done, or within our memory, this is how we've always lived. So to even raise the question of going outside the box on this issue right away makes you sound perhaps a little mad. I'm going to come back to that question, a little mad, later. Okay? Okay. The second issue is that there have been many efforts, of course, in the past 100 years to pose an alternative to capitalism. And every single one of them has failed, and failed quite miserably, in my view. Of course, the most obvious failures of the Soviet Union, or so-called communist China, which they still say they're communist in China, even though they're the biggest growing capitalist power in the world, which is a very interesting conundrum that we have here. So much for needing to have democracy in order to have capitalist accumulation. You have a communist party regulating cowboy capitalism, such as they would be somewhat embarrassed about down in Texas. But in any case, there's no question that these societies which promised to deliver some alternative to capitalism turned out not to be an alternative at all. They produced totalitarian dictatorships that did not improve, for the most part, the standards of living of their people, or even when they did, at a horrible, horrible social cost. And in fact, far from representing an alternative to capitalism, they basically operated according to many of the central principles of capitalism, only in a corrupted form by controlling the economy under the hands of the state. In other words, I would say that the Soviet Union and Communist China were state capitalists that simply used a kind of a threadbare ideology of Marxist-Leninism to claim there was something they weren't. Now, however one views these issues, the fact that there are serious barriers to I've just mentioned, to even opening up a discussion about a possible alternative to capitalism, I think has led to a very famous phrase, which is more than a phrase. It was coined by that great philosopher. Well, I don't know if it was coined by her, but it was certainly employed by her a lot, the great philosopher Margaret Thatcher. When she said, back in the 1970s, there is no alternative. TINA, it's called. There is no alternative. That is, when she said it's time to start to destroy the trade unions in England, cut down their power, throw everything into the free market, create what she called an ownership society. We had that here too, led to a housing bubble. But in any case, when she said that is the only game in town, and when people tried to criticize her policies, she said, but there is no alternative. Socialism, we can't talk about that anymore. There is no alternative, and there's no other kind of capitalism. There's this. No more Keynesianism, no more welfare state. This is the only alternative. Otherwise, something else we can do. Now, my claim that I want to make is that what can enable us to at least envision an alternative and break out of TINA, break out of this ideological manacle which says there is no alternative. William Blake, the great English poet, had a phrase I love. He called mind-forged manacles of unfreedom. You see, if you allow your mind to be shackled, nobody has to worry about what you're going to do, because your actions always follow your thoughts. So if your mind is shackled by yourself, then they don't have to bother with real change. They've already got you chained. So in any case, my claim I want to make is that to break those kind of mental chains, I think what we have to and envision an alternative that is beyond capitalism. Where we have to begin with that is to look at some neglected aspects of Marx's work. Not that he answered the question, but he had more in his body of thought that has been appreciated about this question. Now, nobody doubts that Marx had a lot to say against capitalism. I don't think anybody denies that. He wrote many, many books, many works, and in every single one of them, he's got something bad to say about capitalism, very detailed critiques. But the standard view is, not just by his opponents, but by his followers, has been that, well, he never really talked very much about what is the alternative to capitalism. Now, that's a myth, I contend, but like all myths, it has a germ of truth. For two reasons. One is that Marx did not like to draw what he called blueprints about the future. He said that my task is to show what is wrong with present-day society and to give indications or hints about how it can be, how these can be altered. But he didn't present himself as a prophetic figure that was going to outline a detailed blueprint of what people ought to do in the future. In this sense, I think he was much in the spirit of that great American socialist Eugene Debs, when he once said that I do not want to lead the masses into the promised land of socialism, because if I can lead them into it, then I can lead them out of it. And he said he would prefer rather to go with them together. So Marx doesn't like blueprints about the future, so you're not going to find any in his work. Secondly, he never wrote a specific book or even a lengthy essay specifically detailing his concept of a post-capitalist society. He never wrote a work devoted to that subject per se. However, The thing about Marx you have to keep in mind is that while he wrote an enormous amount, his Gesamtausgabe, that is his complete works in German that are still in the process of being assembled, now total 77 volumes of 600-700 pages apiece. There's 24 more volumes to go that haven't been done yet. He wrote an enormous amount, but he published in his lifetime very little because he was a perfectionist. He didn't like to publish unless he felt he was just got it right. And so the problem is that Marx, Albert Camus, the great French philosopher, once made a phrase, and he said this, you know what the problem with Marxists is? 99% of them have never read Marx. And I think that's also true of people who are not Marxists. And one of the reasons is, frankly, we can't, some of it, what's there hasn't been read, but there's a lot that wasn't available also for decades after his death. And in fact, some of it has only become recently known, or it's in the process of now becoming known. So in my book, I go through, I'm not saying I went through all 77 volumes, but I went through as much as I could, including some unpublished material and manuscripts and notes and whatnot, to try to pull together suggestions in his various works that would point in this direction. That's the subject of today's talk. So here I'm just going to briefly relate a few of the things I discovered in this research. And yes, no pictures, but we'll get to that maybe another day. All right, I'm going to focus on, well first, what did Marx see as the alternative to capitalism? It's, first of all, very different from what the so-called Marxist regimes of the 20th century thought was the alternative to capitalism. First, Marx opposed any idea of a single-party state that would control society. And he fought with many of his closest followers about this during his lifetime. People who thought you can have a shortcut to changing society by putting power into the hands of some political party or even workers' dictator to push through social change. Ferdinand Lassalle, who at first had been a colleague of Marx broke off relations with him. He was the leader of the German workers' movement, and Marx broke off relations with him because he says in a letter, "This man is a future workers' dictator. I want nothing more to do with him." Throughout his life, Marx was a firm supporter of political democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. There is no evidence in Marx's work to the contrary. He was a firm defender of democracy in that Enlightenment liberal tradition. His critique of Enlightenment liberalism was not that it was in favor of democracy. He felt it didn't expand democracy to enough sectors of society, a point I'll come back to later. Second, which may surprise some of you even more, Marx never advocated state control of the economy. Now, this is a very funny thing because, I don't have to tell you how many times I mention the word Marx and they say, oh, he's the one that believed that the government should control everything. Government should own everything. Isn't that a bad idea? I said, yeah, he thought it was a bad idea too. Well, that's what Marx believed. I said, well, could you please show me where he says this? And I, again, haven't read all 77 volumes, and there's 24 more to go, but I haven't found a single line where he says so. Instead, in fact, if you read his 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts, which has come down to us as the Humanist Essays, Marx actually critiques those radicals of his time who held that state control of state ownership of the economy, abolition of private property and its replacement by nationalized property, nationalized ownership of industry. He attacked people who advocated that, calling them crude, stupid, and unthinking, vulgar communists. I don't think that was a compliment. By the way, later on in Capital, his greatest work, he referred to what he called capitalist communism. Those who advocate a kind of communism based on state control of the economy. Now, granted, Marx was critical of private ownership of the means of production. He was never against private ownership of your goods and services. He didn't say you should not have a right to own your own house or your own clothes. By the way, he gave his kids piano lessons, and I'm sure he didn't want the piano confiscated by the revolutionaries either. Not to mention the Cuban cigars he liked. But in any case, the point is, he didn't oppose private ownership of the means of production in that sense. What he meant by the means of production are large-scale business enterprises and the ownership of somebody else's labor, treating it as a commodity. That's what Marx opposed when he opposes private property. So in other words, Marx did not counterpose the so-called anarchy of the free market to the so-called organization that could be established by a centrally planned state-run economy. He considered both the free market and state-run economies to be different forms of capitalism based on alienated relations of production in which human relations take on the form of relations between things. This was Marx's main criticism of capitalism, is that human relationships tend increasingly to take on the form of relationships between things. In modern society, we no longer are treating each other as persons, as people. We're treating each other as commodities, as how much are you worth to me in a purely monetary economic sense. That's what he didn't like. And that was the central critique of capitalism. So, he held that the central problem of capitalism is not the existence of private property or the market, but rather the domination of what he called value production. Now, what is meant by value production, or production for the sake of value? Now, please understand, in English, the word value has two very different meanings. So first, what it does not mean. If I look at you and I say, well, I value your smile, you're lovely. You have a nice smile, actually. If I say that, that has nothing to do with economics, obviously, right? I'm not suggesting how much money I'd be willing to pay for it, God forbid. And by the way, you feel very offended if anybody treated things that you value in this sense in monetary terms, okay? But when we use the word value in economics, like what's the value of my Honda Fit, or what's the value of my stock option, etc., etc., we're not using the word value in the sense of, oh, I value your smile, I value your company. We're using it in terms of what? What? Dollars and cents. Computing wealth in monetary terms. That's what we mean by value in economics. So, when Marx says that capitalism is a system based on value production, he's saying it's a system in which material wealth increasingly takes the form of a monetary expression, and the only form of material wealth that ultimately becomes fundamentally important to us in the eyes of the dominant ideology is monetary, that which can be monetarized, that which can be given a number and be bought and sold. Now, just on this, a lot of people think that it would be perfectly natural, of course, to have a monetary, to compute material wealth in monetary terms. But I'll just use this little exercise on you that I often use with my students. Think about it this way. Think about, because I like to cook, I can work out ideas that way. And I like friendship, and I like having friends over, how lovely that is, and have nice philosophical discussions deep into the night. I'm sure everybody is doing. But in any case, how about this? How about if you decide, I'm going to, have a little dinner and some wine and, whatever, invite a few friends over, and, you're having a good time, everybody's enjoying themselves, then it's about 1 o'clock in the morning, it's about time for everybody to leave, and you stand at the door and say, oh, by the way, $40, please. How many friends would you have after that? Now, the fact that you're laughing indicates what? That you realize that there are some parts of human existence that cannot and should not be monetarized, right? You feel it's unnatural. So why is it that we then say, oh, but it's natural for material wealth to always take a monetary expression? There's a contradiction here, isn't there? So value is not natural, it's a historically produced manifestation of a particular period of social existence. Now, according to Marx, value, what the value of something is in terms of money, shows itself how? It shows itself in the relationship of exchange, what he calls exchange value. And as capitalism develops, he argued, exchange value becomes the social bond that connects individuals more and more. That is, our social relations tend to cease to be direct, person to person, face to face, but rather our social relations become mediated by something that is abstract. Exchange value, this abstract number printed on a dollar bill or whatnot. And as capitalism unfolds in due time, more and more human relations become dominated and even reduced to exchange value, to the point where you even then sometimes say, well, if it's not, what am I going to get out of this? I even hear sometimes people say, you know, what's the worth of having that person as a friend? What can I get out of them? What can I use them for? Whew, ugly way of speaking, but I hear it said more and more, you see. But this is part of social relations becoming dominated by exchange value. In other words, what happens with this concept of exchange value as the most important social relationship is what goes along with it is the notion that nothing has intrinsic value. Now I'm using value in the other sense. Right? Nothing has intrinsic worth or value. It is valuable or worth only in so much as the money can fetch. Now, Marx, by the way, was not the first person to criticize the destructive implications of this, of reducing everything to value and exchange value. And I want to mention that it was noted as far back as the ancient Greeks and others, especially the works of Aristotle. That is, if you read Aristotle, in his Politics, he makes a distinction between two types of wealth. One type is concrete material goods that furnish a real need of a household or an individual. The second type of wealth is wealth acquisition pursued for its own sake through money. Now, Aristotle sees the second, wealth acquisition for its own sake, pursued through money, he views that as highly destructive. Because wealth computed in material terms is concrete, and therefore it's limited. I mean, how much clothes can you have? How many shoes can you have, unless you're a Melvin Marcos? I mean, how big a square foot house do you really need? I had a discussion with some people at Loyola University last night at a dinner party. And one guy was saying, I just don't understand, like, why would anybody need a 40,000-foot mansion, which is being built by a former presidential candidate who didn't win an election, who the name I'm not going to mention. But in any case, why do you need that bigger house? And then somebody else said, well, I wouldn't mind. And I said, he said, without living in a cave, why do you need something that big? Well, an interesting discussion came with this. Well, in a certain sense, he was acknowledging a lot of other people in the discussion. Material wealth has limits. There's only so much you can eat in one day, after all, my goodness. Even me, who really puts it away. Okay, now, but on the other hand, whereas material wealth is concrete and limited, wealth computed in money is abstract, and therefore it's unlimited. That's what Aristotle says. Unlimited. By the way, I think this is why, have you ever met anybody that's come up to you and said, oh, by the way, I've got too much money. Here, take some. I'm waiting for that, and by the way, if they do so, please send me their email. But it hasn't happened yet. Okay. But what is it about that? There's a drive here. The more it's like a drug. The more you get, the more you have to have. Right? Even a drug is limited, whereas money is unlimited in a certain sense. It's the ultimate addiction. That's right. So now here's the interesting point, I think. However, unlike in modern capitalism, where accumulating money as an end in itself is often viewed as the greatest good, in the ancient world, not just the Greek, but especially the Greek world, it's viewed as the source of humanity's misery and woe. So let me read what Aristotle says in his Politics on this. I'm quoting him directly. Money itself is nonsense and wholly artificial, not natural at all. The wealth that derives from this kind of wealth acquisition is without limit. Some people believe that they should maintain their store of money or increase it without limit. The reason they are so disposed to think this, however, is that they are preoccupied with living, but not with living well. Now, of course, here's always the big question. What would you rather do? Live or live well? Well, if you answer the second, you see what's going on here. But the point is that whereas wealth computed in monetary terms, in terms of value or exchange value, today is very dominant, it did not dominate social relations in the ancient world. So why does it dominate social relationships? In the ancient world, what Aristotle was critiquing was still a peripheral problem. It was not the core issue of Greek society. There was commodity exchange, there was exchange value, but it was on the margins, and he was worried that it might flood in and corrupt the society, but it was still not central to that society, those ancient societies. It is central to ours. So the question to be asked is, why is it central to ours and it wasn't central to the ancients? Well, the reason for this is that exchange value can become, according to Marx at least, the universal medium of all human relations only when a specific kind of labor dominates society. Because, according to Marx, labor is the source of all value. So its value dominates in society now in terms of determining social relations. There has to be a certain type of labor that produces that type of situation. So what is the type of labor that explains why value or exchange value becomes the universal determinant and medium of social relations in the modern world? The kind of labor, Marx called it abstract, undifferentiated labor. Now, what is that? Bear with me. According to Marx, every moment in which somebody works, two simultaneous types of labor occur in the same instant. It's not one and then the other. Every instant, two types of forms of labor manifest themselves. One is what he calls concrete labor, which is the concrete exertion of specific skills employed in doing what you're doing. So if you're tailoring, you're a tailor, your concrete labor is tailoring. If you're a weaver, your concrete labor is weaving. If you're a teacher, your concrete labor is teaching sector, right? It's specific and concrete. But in modern industrial society, he argues, labor takes on increasingly a uniform, monotonous expression. At the same time, it becomes indifferent to its material content. It becomes abstract, which he calls abstract labor. That is, abstract labor is indifferent to any kind of concrete labor. What does it mean for an abstract labor to be indifferent? Well, it's just like when we talk, oh, I'm going to work tomorrow. Most people don't say, oh, I'm going to work tomorrow. You know, most people say, oh, I'm going to work. And work becomes what? This sameness, right? Oh, I'm going to be doing the same thing over and over. Now, not all jobs are like this, granted, and Marx never said they were. But the point, some jobs are much more creative than others. But, if you think about that old film, Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times, you know, where the guy is roped up onto the big gears in the assembly line, right? Literally becomes an appendage to a machine, and his arms and his legs just become a pure mechanical, routinized motion. The person gets turned into an abstraction. But that's not just in a film, you know. We all love our iPhones, right? But how are they made? After all, 1 million workers in China and Foxconn producing them, in which the labor is so boring, so monotonous, so routine, so abstract, so indifferent to the concrete human sensuous abilities of the workers employed in producing those phones that what? Foxconn has installed, what do they call those things in the circus to prevent you from dropping to the floor? Nets. Nets at the window, because 13 workers have jumped out the window to commit suicide in the last year. So now when they jump out the window, they hit the net. Okay? I mean, it's very tragic, right? It shows you how dehumanized the conditions of labor can become. This is what Marx said is novel and specific about capitalism. Abstract or alienated labor dominates over concrete labor. More and more and more. Now, abstract labor is the substance of exchange value. As abstract labor takes over and subsumes concrete labor, exchange value comes to dominate social relations. Now, this gets us to the key issue. Value production dominates in societies dominated by abstract or alienated labor. Societies in which workers, that is, lose all control over the work process, their laboring activity becomes more monotonous and routine, in which workers become more and more an appendage to the machine. So in sum, Marx argues that human relations take on the form of things because in their process of producing things, workers, laborers are treated as things. Their own activity becomes thing-like. Their own activity becomes thing-like because they have lost control over their own process of laboring. So we don't only become alienated from the things we produce. More important to Marx is that we become alienated from the very process by which we produce them. We no longer feel at home in our own labor, and we feel truly at home only when we're not laboring. So we have that separation of the public and the private that comes in the modern era. So, as a result, although we are the ones who create value, exchange value, and money, these take on the form of external things that dominate and control us, precisely because we're alienated from the very process by which we make these things. Now, this is what I call the Frankenstein effect. You know, it's a really great book. Forget about the movies. We're not showing that. But I don't know what's the last time you actually read Mary Shelley's, you know, the original story, Frankenstein. What's the point of the story? Is it a horror movie? Well, it is a horror movie, but that's not really the point, you know. What is the point? The point is to say, in modern society, human beings become dominated by the products of their own creation. That is, Dr. Frankenstein creates this invention, and this thing takes on a life of its own, dominates, controls, and ultimately kills him. Exactly what happens in capitalism to the worker, at least figuratively, if not metaphorically, if not literally. And by the way, Mary Shelley was what? A socialist. Okay? A socialist. So, for Marx, to eliminate conditions in which value production dominates, distorts, and ultimately destroys human relationships, requires what? It requires a new kind of non-alienated activity in which concrete human needs, not the generation of profit, money, or exchange value as an end in itself, governs social production and reproduction. This need for a new kind of freely associated, non-alienated labor is at the heart of what I consider Marx's concept of a genuine post-capitalist society and an alternative to capitalism. Now, of course, that raises the big question. What do you have to do to create such a new kind of non-alienated labor that would transform this kind of scenario that we've been painting? That is, how does Marx envision ending the dominance of exchange value and value production through the creation of a new kind of non-alienated, freely associated labor and human relationships in general? Well, I'll mention 5 points that I certainly are there in his writings, in one way or another. 1, extend democracy into the economic sphere, into the workplace. Marx, as I mentioned, was not against democracy. He was for political democracy. But he had a critique of the established form of political democracy, because his question is, why is democracy limited to, you know, voting once every 2 or 4 years for a particular candidate for political matters, but you don't really get to vote for your boss, do you? Not that often. And you definitely very rarely get to vote. Sometimes there's some input, but most, especially industrial enterprises or maybe service industries, you don't have a vote on the form of your labor itself. How fast you're working, what you're being told to do. You don't really have much input. You don't have much decision power. You don't have much democratic input. Which means what? Somebody else is able to impose their will upon you, and if they control the means of production, they are looking at you as simply a thing to augment their value. Therefore, what they're concerned about is the augmentation or increase of their profit and value, not how good you feel about doing what you're doing in the process of creating that good or service. So democracy has to be extended to the workplace. But how do you do that? Well, one way is through workers' cooperatives. That's the second point, where employees exert ownership rights over their workplace. Instead of having a separation, those who work at the enterprise do not have an ownership stake in the enterprise, and there's a separate ownership outside the workforce, stockholders, etc., that control it and dictate terms to it. You have workers' cooperatives where employees exert both ownership and work activity at the same time, which means 3, eliminating the social division of labor between ownership and non-ownership. Workers have a direct stake in the outcome of their labor. 4, in controlling the workplace, workers would be free to create less alienating and harmful relations of production. Because after all, I mean, if you give people some freedom or input into democratic control into their mode of work, would they decide to make their work more alienating? Probably not. I mean, they could, but the more likelihood is that they would choose to make it less so. And 5th, obviously coordination between different cooperatives or enterprises would be needed. Definitely on a national, if not an international level. You can't simply have independent workshops or cooperatives doing what they want completely on their own. There would be need for coordination, but it could be through a democratically elected planning authority, not a centralized distant state, but a democratically elected planning authority that could be subject its representatives to recall if need be. Now actually, this is not so pie in the sky as it sounds, because Marx drew many of these ideas from an actual historical event, the Paris Commune of 1871. In other words, in that period, actually we're living on the anniversary of it, right? Because it happened in March 1871. March 8th, 1871. Hey, it's International Women's Day. Okay, we'll have a toast for that. All right, the Paris Commune emerged in Paris, and what was it? Workers of Paris, the population, the entire population, not just the workers, took control of the city. The government troops, they tried to take back control. A group of women, which is why we have March 8th, International Women's Day, marched up to the French soldiers and they said, you're going to shoot, you're going to have to shoot us first. You're going to kill us before you kill our husbands who are working in the factories. The soldiers turned around and shot their commanding officer who said, shoot them. And the rest of the soldiers fled and the workers took over the city and ran it for 72 days under a cooperative system of self-determination, under a cooperative structure. Now, there was still a government in that short period of time, what was called the government of the Parisian Commune. It was only the city of Paris. There was still a government, so there's still a kind of state, but the state was became subservient to society, that is, to the decisions of the producers. Instead of, as exists today, society is subordinate to the state. In other words, contrary to the prevailing view, Marx didn't think the state should prevail over society. He thought even where a state is needed, a state should be subservient to the decisions of the popularly assembled society. Now that's of course very different than the situation in both our society and the so-called communist states, where the state very often acts as an oppressive force to control the free association of individuals. And as opposed to many of his followers, Marx argued to the contrary, that that was not the way to go. There would still, of course, be productive enterprises in his model of a post-capitalist society, as what there was in the Paris Commune, and there would have to be a situation in which workers would decide through their own democratic agency how much, what they did in the Paris Commune, they produced and then they made a so-called profit, you can call it that, or it takes a different form, and to decide how that surplus of what they produce, how much of that should go back to their consumption needs, how much should be given to charity, how much should be shared with other cooperatives to build roads or schools or hospitals, etc. And this would be democratically deliberated and debated. And there was a lot of this kind of debate in the Paris Commune itself. That is, society mandates that some of its excess product is put aside for social uses like education, health, etc. The rest is shared by the workers in the enterprise. Hence, they control the economic mechanism instead of the economic mechanism controlling them. That's really the key point. For Marx, it's not the economic mechanism that should control us, it's we that should control it. Now, just as a tangent here, you know, I get very annoyed sometimes when I listen to the news, but for reasons that might surprise you. And I'm told that I'm very unpleasant to listen to the news with. Because something like this often happens. I start screaming and shouting at the screen, throwing socks and underwear at it. But in particular, what really I find boggling is when I hear something like this. Oh, the economy is doing better this week. Oh, the economy is taking a downturn. Now, they talk about the economy is doing this and doing that as if it's some outside force. It's like they're talking about the weather passing, it's like the Gulf Stream passing over Chicago. Right? It's like the economy is doing this and that to us. But I think that's a very strange, perverse way of speaking. Why? Because what is the economy except the sum total of you and I and everybody else on earth? That's what the economy is. So why do we talk about the economy as a person apart, as a separate thing from us, when we are the economy? Why? Because in capitalist society, the economy does function as a person apart from us, precisely because we, in our activity of generating the economy, are separated from our own activity. We're alienated from our own activity. In other words, Marx said, in capitalist society, we become dominated by the products of our own hand. So social relations are inverted. Everything is upside down. We're controlled by what we produce to the point where we don't even realize we are the ones that produce what controls us. Now, it's a very interesting, this word inversion in German, because the German word for inversion can be translated several different ways. And Marx plays with this. He's a great ironist, and he loved to play with this word. It can be translated as inversion, perversion, or madness. It's an upside-down world, and an upside-down world is a mad world. That's basically what Marx is saying. We're living in madness. It's mad to think of the economy as something other than us, even when we create it, but it still functions as other than us in its own way. So, the point is, what Marx drew from the Paris Commune was an indication of how human relations could that do not necessarily have to take the form of relations between things, these sort of cooperative structures. Humans could figure out how to be governed by their own conscious decisions and deliberation, and not oppressed by the powers of their own hand, but the people govern the people govern the mechanism rather than the mechanism governing the people. Now, granted, trying to get to the finish line here. What I've been laying out, just very briefly, touching on a few points from my book, obviously would mean a big change of society for any of this to be implemented. And after all, in Paris in 1871, you know how long it lasted? 72 days. The French army came back and crushed it, and they killed 30,000 people. It was pretty nasty. Kind of set back France for decades in terms of the brutal repression. What I'm talking about would require a very dramatic change of society, and would require living in a world very different from the one we're now used to. So here is the biggest objection to what Marx advocates, or what I'm advocating, I think. The view that human nature just doesn't permit it. You can talk all you want about the nice theories, about how things could be different, but in the final analysis, capitalism is the way it is because it corresponds to human nature. Now, I want to try to respond to that here by asking, is it really true that you can't have a functioning society that isn't dominated by exchange value and value production? Because it's simply human nature for it to be dominated by exchange value and value production and monetary remuneration, etc. Now I'm going to go to an odd place to make my case. It's not Marx. It's not a Marxist. It's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There's a new book out by a guy called David Pink called Drive, Surprising Truths About What Motivates Us. Very interesting book. Now, one thing that he talks about in this book is, as against the view that external rewards, like money, are the key to motivating people to be better and to be more productive, many studies have shown the opposite, that optimal performance comes not from monetary reward, but from finding intrinsic value in the meaning of one's activity. So I'm going to read out from his book a study that was commissioned at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I don't think is a Marxist institution. And I'm quoting directly from David Pink about this study. They took a whole group of students, and I'm quoting now. They took a whole group of students and they gave them a set of challenges. Things like memorizing strings of digits, solving word puzzles, other kinds of spatial puzzles, even physical tasks like throwing a ball through a hoop. To incentivize their performance, they gave them 3 levels of reward. If you did pretty well, you got a small monetary reward. If you did medium well, you got a medium monetary reward. If you did really well, if you were at one of the top performers, you got a very large cash prize. Now here's what they found out. As long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses work as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better the performance. But once the task calls for even rudimentary cognitive skills, a larger reward led to poorer performance. Now How could that possibly be? Yes. This conclusion seems contrary to what a lot of us learned in economics, which is that the higher the reward, the better the performance. And they're saying that once you get above rudimentary cognitive skill, it's the other way around, which seems like the idea that those rewards don't work that way, which seems vaguely left-wing and socialist, doesn't it? Now, goes on. When the MIT people saw the result of this, they said, but there's possibly something wrong with the experiment, you know? There's something wrong here. It's just against everything we've always been taught to believe. And so they say, maybe that $50 or $60 prize you're offering the students isn't sufficient for motivating an MIT student. So they went to Madurai in rural India, and did the experiment again, where $50 or $60 is a lot of money. It's probably like $1,000 to them is what $50 is to us. 1,000 is to us, but 50 is to them. They replicated the experiment in India, and what happened was that the people offered the medium reward did no better than the people offered the small reward, but this time around, the people offered the top reward did the worst of all. Higher incentives led to worse performance. This experiment has been replicated over and over again by psychologists, by sociologists, by economists. And what it shows, he says, is for simple, straightforward tasks. Those kinds of incentives work. But when the task requires some conceptual, creative thinking, those kind of motivators demonstratively don't work. The best use of money as a motivator is to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Pay people enough so they're not thinking about money and they're thinking about the work itself. You get a bunch of people then who are doing highly skilled work, but they're willing to do it for free and volunteer their time, 20, sometimes 30 hours a week, and what they create they give away rather than sell it. That's what all the study shows. Now, I bet you this is not what they've been telling you on Fox News. Now, this idea of doing work and feeling so good about it that it is its own incentive to the point where you want to give to the other and even give your time to the other without expectation of monetary reward, that's exactly what Marx meant by socialism. When he said the highest expression of it is from each according to their ability to each according to their need. It's the ethic of gift-giving. That is, if your activity is not alienated but meaningful, which is a big if, then it turns out that people give even more of their ability than they otherwise would. Hence, to create the kind of society envisioned by Marx, I'm arguing, does not require leaping out of or changing our human nature. We don't have to become perfect people. By the way, I don't want to speak for you, but I don't think we are. I know I'm not. You don't have to expect people to turn into perfect, wonderful, something they're not. All that it takes is to realize the human potential we already have, but which is being thwarted by the present social and economic and political relations. And all of us have this potential to give to others and society when what we do is qualitatively meaningful to us. So in that, I think I'm going to give the last word to Shakespeare in that lovely play, Romeo and Juliet, in which he has Juliet say the following: "My bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love as deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite." Okay, I think I'm supposed to field questions, comments, so I'll repeat them so everybody can hear. Yes? Okay, tell us the name of your book and how you can get it. Now, first, the title is Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism. Second, it has an exchange value. But I did not write it under that incentivization. By the way, I'm mentioning that because it's now in hardcover, which is ridiculously expensive because it's published by Brill Academic Publishers. But Haymarket Books in Chicago is going to be publishing a paperback version of it in June. So the price will come down quite considerably. So if you go online and try to buy it now, well, it's, I think, ridiculously expensive, but it will be a nice, cheap paperback. They're already taking orders for it at Haymarket. Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism. And it will be published in June in paperback. Okay.
What economic thinker or theorist today probably would resemble what you said in terms of an upside-down world and would be reflective of Marx's thinking?
What economic thinker would be more reflective? Economic thinker would be more reflective of Marx's thinking today? It's a very good question. You see, if you had asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago, I'd have a hard time responding in terms of a well-known economist because you have to understand, economics departments long ago in the United States stopped teaching Marx. And matter of fact, they long ago stopped hiring anybody who was equipped to. Not only that, economics departments in most U.S. universities do not teach Keynes. And think it would be horrible, the thought of raising Keynes even in the discussion within neoliberal economics, because he's just put outside the pale. He's considered too radical. Keynes, right, who's a supporter of capitalism. So, in terms of the economics profession, what's happened is there's been a whittling out of dissident voices and alternative voices, at least in the United States to a large degree, but not completely. If you watch Bill Moyers' program on PBS, he had a 2-part interview just 2 weeks ago or so with Rick Wolff, who's a good friend of mine. Rick Wolff used to head the economics department at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And he has a very nice book out called Capitalism Hits the Fan, an analysis of the 2008 economic crisis. He's now, get this, he's the NASDAQ chair of economics at the New School for Social Research. Now, when he was offered this chair, it's an endowed chair, so it's very little teaching responsibilities because he was renowned as a great scholar, he's written many books. He said to them, wait a second, he went to the guys at NASDAQ, they were offering him this job, and they say, you realize who I am, I'm a Marxist economist, and you guys are NASDAQ, that's the stock exchange. They say, oh yeah, no, we know, we want to show that we like other points of view too. So, thank you for that. So, I would say Rick Wolff is a good example of that, and he's somebody who, again, I've been reading his work for 20 years, but the circles of people who would know about him or read his work were very small before 2008. After 2008, I mean, last time we were on a, myself, he and David Schweiker, we had when the 2008 crisis broke out, we had like a traveling tour. He's also written an interesting book, David Schweiker, called After Capitalism, on the response to the crisis. We went to 8 or 9 conferences and campuses, the 3 of us speaking from our respective points of view. We were going to put this together in a book, just never got around to it. And the last time I spoke to him, he said he gets so many speaking invitations now, he has to turn down half of them. So there's been this growth of interest as part of the growth of interest in Marxism. So that's one of the examples I can give you of a serious, regarded, well-known, respected economist, even respected enough for NASDAQ to give him a job, but who very much is within this kind of tradition.
I was listening to Bloomberg a couple days ago, and the discussion was about jobs, about our economy here. And the wording was put that they believe in the higher echelons of employment. The word jobs should be eliminated, and the word jobs.
The word job should be eliminated.
And the use of career should be used as a substitute for the word jobs, the career. Now, how does that, in your mind, I know it is in my mind, how does that tie together with the attitude of Wall Street's position as Wall Street being one, and Main Street being the slave labor of Wall Street, which it is? How does that tie in?
Okay, to repeat the question, correct me if I don't get it right, that the Bloomberg newsletter had a discussion about that people are saying in industry, etc., that we should replace the word jobs and try to use the word now for career, when they're trying to employ people?
Correct.
And move away from a job-focused economy to a career-based economy?
Correct.
Okay, very good question. Well, you see, I'm a little suspicious about that whole discussion for the following reason. I think what that is implying is that the direction of the U.S. economy is unable to give employment to large numbers of people any longer in a productive, healthy manner. So the idea, but there are jobs opening up. There are higher echelon jobs. Okay? So we're going to talk about careers, and we're going to kind of like lock out those who can't fit into the higher paid so-called career jobs, like systems analysts, like doctors or lawyers, etc., more high paid, specialized functions that require a high level of education. The rest of the population that used to expect just a job can't expect to get much of anything. And that's what worries me about that kind of talk. For the following reason, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, manufacturing is left the United States. Of course, a lot of manufacturing has left the United States. But people forget that it's only in the last year that the value of, that the U.S. ceased to be the world's largest producer of manufactured goods in terms of total value. I think last year we produced $1.8 trillion worth of manufactured goods. China produced $1.9 trillion. So we have a lot of manufacturing in terms of value output still occurring in the United States. And there's even talk about some of the manufacturing now returning to the U.S., which is starting to happen. But is that going to give jobs to unskilled youth, or even youth who have skills? No. Why? Because the drive to increase the productivity of labor, which is so endemic to capitalism, has reached the point where they can, like in the last 10 years, double the amount of manufacturing output with half or less the number of workers. So I was having a talk, so for instance, you have something like three-dimensional printing, right, which virtually eliminates the jobs of production, okay? You still have the jobs of the people who program the robots and everything else and design the robots, very high-skilled, high-paying jobs, but relatively few of them. And you have what's called now black factories. That is, they don't have any lights on inside the factory because they don't need them, because the entire factory is run by robots. The only workers who are there, other than the robots, are people who load in the goods and the people who take it off and put it on the trucks. Now, the question is, therefore, you get to a situation where capitalism becomes unable to give employment to labor anymore. It's only value-creating substance. And what happens to all these other people who can't be systems analysts or lawyers or doctors or designing robots? They're forgotten about. The New York Times had an article last week that relates to your question as well, that many employers now are requiring a college BA degree, not the AA degree or an AD degree, a BA degree for the most menial minimum wage jobs like being a file clerk, because there's such a large source of unemployed youth. In places like Spain, 50% of youth under the age of 30 are unemployed. 50%, it's endemic and permanent. So they're increasing the skill requirement in terms of a college education, which means they're coming in, these youth, with large student loan debt, which can never be written off even if you declare bankruptcy, and yet they're earning $8 an hour as a file clerk, right? So what kind of future does that provide for them? So for that reason, I think that's kind of like hiding something that should be brought out.
Hi. Along with, to follow up to what you just said, the way I see it today is we have, say, 47% of the population receiving entitlements. We have, say, 49% who are the producers out there working. 1% has 93% of the money of the world, I mean, of the United States. But this is not just the United States. China, they have a lot of older people, too, and they're going to have the same problem. But I was just wondering, we will see the producers providing for the entitlement groups for many decades in the future. But do you think that eventually it'll even out with the, baby boomers eventually dying out?
Okay, you had raised the question of 47% of people in the United States get entitlements, and you want to know whether eventually that's going to even out to the point where the number of people who are paying into the system increases, equates to those getting out. Well, I don't think that's correct, that 47% of the American people get entitlements. I think 97% of the American people get entitlements. They just don't realize the entitlements that they're getting. Because if you take out a mortgage, and your mortgage loan is 3.4%, that's probably because of federal intervention in the housing industry, which keeps that interest rate as low as it is, through Fannie Mae, etc. So you're getting an effective subsidy. Although you don't realize it, doesn't show up in the form of food stamps. But it's a subsidy. If you're getting Social Security, veterans benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. So the notion that there is two groups of people in America, those who are producing and not taking government benefits versus those who are not producing and are getting public benefits, that is a framework of discussion I think is inaccurate. I think what's happening is that on different levels, and especially on the corporate level, there's a huge amount of corporate entitlements and corporate welfare. They're being shoveled full of corporate tax entitlements. You have a situation where, for instance, there is in the tax code, it was originally invented to help poor farmers back in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl, that said if you bought a piece of land and then resold it, you could not be taxed on the capital gains you got on selling that small piece of land. Now this has been written into the tax code so that corporations can do this in terms of any basic capital expense. Does not get written into the tax code. They can write it off or even get a deduction for it. And it's been estimated that that cost the Treasury upwards of $1 trillion a year when you add it all up. Some people have estimated that much. That's an entitlement. But we don't speak of that as entitlements. So I think what's actually, and by the way, many of the people who are getting a so-called entitlement, like, let's say, unemployment insurance, work and have worked most of their lives, they're laid off for a few months and they get an entitlement for a few months. Many people are the working poor who are getting food stamps, a link card, but they're working, they're producing value, but they can't support themselves, they don't have a living wage. Because after all, the minimum wage should be at least $12.50 an hour to keep up with where it was back in 1970. It's only $7.50 nationally, $8.50 in Illinois. They can't support themselves, so they fall under a level they're entitled to food stamps in some cases. So I think there is, of course, a problem that the population is aging, right? I think what your question is coming from. And in certain countries like Japan, this is a very, very serious issue because it's getting to the point where instead of having, like it used to be with Japan, there was one retiree for every 4 or 5 workers. Now we're getting to the point of 2 workers for every 5 retirees or something like this. How is that going to be paid? How are you going to get that paid into the system? Okay? How is that going to work out in terms of things? Well, one reason the United States has less reason to worry about this than countries like Japan or many European countries is that we have a relatively high birth rate. And one of the reasons for the relatively high birth rate is because we have a large immigrant population. And they do pay taxes, despite the claim that they don't. And they are directly or indirectly paying into the system. So there's actually a very easy way to solve that problem, even if it gets much worse than it is today. We have a much higher percentage of retirees versus productive workers. You can allow for more immigration. Now, I tell this to people sometimes about Japan's population, is going to drop below 60 million in like a generation or 2. I mean, it's dropping like a rock. The population of Uganda, a country the size of Ohio, is going to be larger than Russia's population in 20 years from now. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Russia's is going down like that, Uganda's is going up like that. Well, how could Russia or Japan or us solve that problem if we cannot increase, I don't agree with that assumption, but even if I grant the assumption we can't increase the productivity of labor of those remaining employed? Well, why can't you? I'm sure there's millions of people in China that would love to move to Japan. And they would pay into the system. Now, of course, you can say, oh, but that can't be politically done. Why can't they politically done? Japan has a monoculture where they say we don't want they restrict immigration. Maybe they're going to have to decide whether they want to keep restricting immigration or they want to have a good economy. I mean, we should ask that, too. So this gets us into another discussion, which I've spoken about here before, the immigration debate. But, yeah.
My question is this. If Karl Marx were alive in 2008, what would he have done to the people that created the credit default swaps and the mortgage security out of thin air and basically destroyed many countries and millions of people?
Wow. What would Karl Marx have done if he was around in 2008 to the people responsible for the economic crisis, especially the bankers and the real estate industry, etc.? Well, there's an old saying, too big to jail. Look, this was a criminal kind of an activity, but a completely legal one in a certain sense. It's not that they violated most of these guys' a statute on the books. It was during the Clinton administration, after all, that they took down the Glass-Steagall financial restrictions and allowed for a lot of this kind of wild behavior in terms of the credit default swaps, mushrooming, and everything else, right? But it was highly irresponsible, right? And they knew what they were doing was highly irresponsible. They did it because they were making money out of it. They were actually, and it's not the fault of the homeowners that were buying the houses. It's rather the fault of the system that was set up in which they were able to put $1 million down and then do a 30-to-1 equity swap, a 30-to-1 right, leverage, and you put $1 million, a bank of its own money, into an investment, borrows $30 million. Even if you make a 5% rate of return, you're making a 5% rate of return on the total $31 million, right? Which means you're really making like what, a 30, 40, 50, 60% rate of return on your actual investment, and the interest rate was so low you're not really paying anything back in terms of interest on your initial bank loan. So this was a widespread corrosive kinds of practices. They were dumping all sorts of offering all sorts of loans to people who couldn't pay them back, knowing that they couldn't pay them back because they didn't have. They figured their bank is not going to be responsible for getting the hit because they've sliced and diced the loans to 1,000 other banks, right? So and then they take out insurance to make sure that they get paid back if it does go down. I mean, it's really like an incredible system. It's like taking out insurance that you get more money back if your house does burn down. I mean, the example that was often used, right? But the question, what would Marx do about that? I think he would probably say jail a good many of them, yes. And he would probably say if they're too big to jail, well, I don't know. I mean, Marx didn't really talk about those things directly. He really didn't have a vindictive personality in that kind of a way. But I think he would have been disgusted, and I think he really would have loved to investigate the psychological mentality of people drawn into this kind of speculation, because he does that in his own writings, where he tries to say, why do people get drawn into this type of thing, and tries to show the hypocrisy of claiming that they're doing something, that the market will sort out all the problems, and then when the market doesn't sort out the problems and the government bails them out, they still complain about the government getting too big. So you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Didn't they have large salaries they were getting?
Sure.
It was incentives like $200 and $300 and $400 million a year.
Oh yes, you're asking whether weren't they getting large salaries for this? You were getting a salary that was, I mean, I had some of my ex-students that became what they called quantos. They went down to U of C, they were math whizzes. They were hired straight out of college at $300,000 a month, 22 years old, to work at some of these Wall Street firms. And I knew one person in particular. He moved out to California. He bought himself an $800,000 house or something like that up in the Oakland Hills. And he thought life was perfect for him and everything. And then it just popped, right? And he doesn't have that house anymore. But the point is, yes, they were getting, the reason they did it is because it was in their economic self-interest in a very narrow individualistic sense. But this is part of what capitalism does, right? It doesn't allow you, when you're in that position, and I don't even blame them on a certain level. Look, if you're a businessman, if you're owning a business, and you're in competition with other businesses, I'm now not talking about people like doing that really nasty financial speculation. I'm talking about an honest businessman. If you're an honest businessman, I mean, and I have to mention this, because I want to skip this. If you read Marx's Capital, he paints the capitalists in the prettiest of colors, actually. He basically says, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume they're angels, the capitalists. Then he goes on to show, even if we assume they're angels, the system is still horrendous. Because his critique of capitalism is not that it's caused by the capitalists. It's not the capitalists that determine capital. It's capital that determines the capitalists. You see? Human relations take on the form of relations between things. But if you're an honest businessman and you're in competition, and somebody else is selling the product at less than you are, you need to cut your expenses. What's the first thing any business cuts in terms of expense? Labor costs. They don't cut capital costs. But you feel impelled to do so, understandably, to keep up with your competition insofar as you're tied into the logic of capital. So lastly, I don't want to go on too much about this, but I had a lunch a few weeks ago with somebody at Oakton at the Des Plaines campus in the mechanical engineering department. So I said, oh, that's an interesting field I don't know anything about, even though my father was a tool and die maker, so, go to show, didn't rub off. Anyway, so I say, tell me about this 3D printing. Are you teaching students about this? Oh, yes, and I'm involved in a business where we do this. So I said, that must employ a lot less workers now, right? Once we start moving into 3D printing. He says, well, of course, that's the whole point. I said, well, that's going to really cut the business expenses, right? He says, well, not necessarily. Sometimes it's more expensive to do it with less workers because you have to invest so much in the technology. So I said, why would a business do that? If it's going to cost more money to invest in the technology, why even do it? He says, well, because labor costs are the most expendable cost. It just makes sense, he says. It's the easiest to cut because capital grows big with capital. Capital grows big with value. This is Marx's point. Okay, I think we didn't get some of it inside.
I believe I saw something on television several months ago about a company that was probably family-owned, and there was more democracy in this company that strikes of what you were talking about. Do you see more of that? Do you see it on any large scale? Is it only the mom and pops where they, bring the employees in, they train them to do different jobs, they have profit sharing when the profit comes in? It seems like it might be just a one-off, but I'm hoping that maybe there's more examples that you know of.
She's asking about like a family business that runs more along the lines of what I was talking about, and how predominant is that? You're asking? Very good question. The person who knows most about this is a fellow, Gera Alpovitz, who's a sociologist that's written a study which shows that there's actually a lot more cooperatives in the United States than most people are aware. And there's millions of people actually involved in these cooperative or semi-cooperative sort of ventures. A lot of people moving into devastated inner city Detroit, where of course property values are extraordinarily cheap for not all the best reasons, but in any case who are then forming like urban farming cooperatives or cooperative enterprises to try, in which there's like a democratic accountability amongst the members of the workforce, etc., shared governance, etc. There's a lot actually more of this happening, and it's really one of those things that doesn't get into the news. But I was stunned when I talked with Gare about this, and the number of people who are involved in this in one way or another. Now, of course, a lot of people are not involved in it full time. They might just have some kind of like a neighborhood, gardening cooperative or something like that as a side issue. But still, when you add up the different sort of cooperative things that are out there, it's much more pervasive than we think, and it's been growing. It has been growing. Okay. Oh, wait, you can speak. Somebody who hasn't. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
On a bigger picture, obviously, the globalization is not going to really end dramatically anytime soon. And beside this country, as you mentioned, Spain, Greece, even England, all the more Western countries have a huge disconnect with people not being able to work because of either work going off to the third world and or all this high-tech type of jobs. Are you aware of, are there any like big thinker economists in the world that are talking about ways to address this? Because it just seems to be getting worse in many of these Western countries. It's sort of surprising that we soon aren't going to see, besides just the protests in the streets, even more violent actions in many of these countries that people are just getting totally fed up.
Okay, so the question is, do I see in Europe especially, there seems to be this move for either austerity or replacing labor by capital-intensive industries. Things are getting worse and worse. Is any economist or any major official thinking up a way out of this kind of thing? Well, the predominant discourse among the major players, the answer would have to be no. It really goes back and forth between two debates. One, between those who argue that the austerity is needed and needed now, and needed for the foreseeable future in order for European finances to get back into healthy shape. But as it's pointed out by the other side of the debate, places, not only in Europe, the UK is the best example of this within Europe, they have slashed government spending considerably. They have imposed considerable austerity, and economic growth is lower than ever. So the notion that you're going to take money out of the, you're going to reduce the public debt, and that's going to free up capital to somehow lead to higher employment. Well, I don't know the economic theory that supports this. Well, I mean, I do know the economic theory that supports it, but I don't know of any evidence to suggest that it's correct. But the other side also has a problem, which is the more Keynesian approach, which would like to go back. Paul Krugman, for instance, is a good representative of this, Joseph Stiglitz, people who I respect very much, and I've recently written a commentary critique of some of Krugman's work in terms of this, who think that, well, going back to a more stimulus spending Keynesian approach would be the solution. But the problem there is, for reasons that would take a longer discussion, I think the present crisis of capitalism is much deeper than, is of such a depth that I don't think it can be easily remedied through traditional Keynesian measures. So that's why you don't hear much else among the established parties.
Well, I was asking more than just the politicians. Are there any like big thinker economists, for instance, or even philosophers that are questioning this or tossing out possible alternatives?
Right. Well, here is where you're getting some major philosophers who are raising questions about alternatives to capitalism. Right? Rick Wolff being one of them, who I mentioned earlier. Person who I am critical of on other levels, but he's very much read among many anti-globalization youth, for instance, Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian philosopher who's a very sharp critic of capitalism. His economics is very weak. His political economy is not his area, it's philosophy. But nevertheless, Frederick Jameson, another person who's been writing a lot on this lately, has a book out on this, trying to think at least in terms of a fundamental critique of these two parameters that have come down to us. So there's a lot of people working in different areas on this, and that's part of what my own work is trying to contribute to this discussion on this. But there is really, what's striking to me is the lack of imagination in terms of how to address this problem. In general, especially among the figures that we get to read about in the press. That's why we have to dig around and find some other voices. One last thing I just want to mention, you know, because there's so much talk about debt. Debt, the level of public debt or the level of private debt doesn't matter. I'm speaking just from economics now. What matters to an economy is the level of combined private and public debt. Now, we have a big public debt, 16 trillion, federal budget deficit. We have a much higher level of private debt. Student loan debt is part of that, credit card debt, etc., mortgage debt, etc. Very high levels of debt. Now, what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years? Actually, the level of public debt is coming down relative to GDP. It's dropped about, I don't know, about close to 20%. The level of private debt, okay, has increased 20%. So, in other words, when people talk about a debt crisis and they say, oh, cut the government. Well, wait a second. Read between the lines there. Read the political agenda that's being given to you. Because they're pulling kind of a wool over your eyes, because that's not the really fundamental issue. Now, if private debt is rising at the same time that public debt is rising, yes, then you've got a big problem with public debt. But if public debt is actually coming down relative to private debt, it's simply transferring the same amount of debt from one hand holder into the other. So how is it a crisis for the increase of the public debt, right? So,
Any prediction for the stock market for the next year?
You'll have to, my exchange value is too high for that.